Welcome to Chapter 15 for Bio 111 students Human Biology course. Today we're going to be talking about the urinary system. Now, for the urinary anatomy, basically we are dealing with just a few organs, primarily the kidney. There are two kidneys, the ureters, also two ureters, right, each for each kidney, and a single bladder, right, the urinary bladder that holds the urine. Make sure to follow all of this in the book, obviously. Look at all the illustrations. I made some schematics, some drawings here just to make it a little bit easier to explain, but definitely you will need to look at illustrations in the book to follow this properly. So when we're thinking of the urinary system, we are thinking of the system that essentially uses the kidneys to take the blood, basically all of the blood in the body, and then filter it properly in order to remove waste. And then that waste is mixed with water to become urine that we expel out of the body. So, like I said, the main organs of the urinary system are going to be the kidneys. Then they are connected to these hollow tubes made of muscle called ureters that transport urine from the kidneys after it's been made down into the pelvis to the bladder. And so we have the urinary bladder, and then when the urine is ready to be expelled out of the body, when the person goes to the bathroom to urinate, then the urethra does its job and transports the urine and expels it out of the body. Now, essentially, when you're looking at the kidneys are what's called retroperitoneal organs, which means they're located in the back, behind all the abdominal structures. And now, kidneys are usually covered in a capsule and covered by lots of fat. So we will talk about briefly what the main structure of the kidney that we need to know soon. But essentially, when you do a cross-section of the kidney put under the microscope, it consists of these tubule-like structures or pipe-like structures, kind of like plumbing, that essentially slowly transports blood through these and eventually allows the molecules to be exchanged and filtered through in order to basically get rid of the urine, produce the urine and get rid of it out of the body. Now, so let's summarize the main functions of the kidneys, of the urinary system. Now, keep in mind also there's different terminology, different prefixes that will be used here. So sometimes we're going to say something is renal, that means it's referring to the kidneys. Sometimes we're going to say something is uro something, like a urology, like study, medical study, surgical study of the kidneys. And nephro something also, like with the nephron, which is also referring to the kidneys. Don't be confused by this terminology. It's basically referring to the same urinary system essentially. Now, for us, what's important is that we want to summarize these individual functions. Now, first, very important is that unlike the digestive tract, which we already learned about, the urinary system's job is basically to get rid of the metabolic waste that's produced by cells in the body. So it's not about the food that you've eaten and the waste produced that's removed with the digestive tract. It's all about the individual small molecules produced by every cell in the body, and that essentially winds up in the blood, and this is traveling through the blood. That waste accumulates and poses danger to the normal functioning and normal homeostasis of the body. So it's very important to excrete that metabolic waste, and that's what kidneys are doing. Because so much blood passes through the kidneys, it's very important that this is a great opportunity to maintain water balance. And that's basically what the kidneys are doing, right? So much blood passes through the kidneys. Kidneys are again located next to the aorta, kind of in that middle back section of the body. And because so much water obviously travels in the blood, this is a great way to maintain water balance. So the kidneys are able to either concentrate the urine or dilute urine by either placing more or less water into it through filtration, through through their basic physiology, and that's one of the main ways that the body controls water balance physiologically. Another important concept to remember is how pH is extremely important to be kept in the narrow range for the blood and all body tissues and organs. And because kidneys are able to hold on to acid or give up acid when necessary in a controlled manner, kidneys are also able to maintain acid-base balance properly, and along with the respiratory system are one of the two main organ systems in the body that maintain acid-base balance and allow for proper pH. Keep in mind the normal pH in the blood should be about 7.35 to 7.45, and in order to reach that perfect pH balance, right, you need normally functioning kidneys, and like I said, their ability to either hold on to acid or release more acid in the form of H plus ions is very important. H plus ions are the hydrogen ions. That's how we understand basically acidity in the body. Another way to think about the kidneys, to remember that again, because so much blood is passing through it, kidneys are always able to regulate blood pressure, right? So there's actually a hormone involved in the kidney called renin that deals with the cardiovascular system's effect on blood pressure, along with blood vessels and the function of the heart, obviously. But primarily because the kidneys allow so much blood to pass through it and need blood to be passing in just the correct pressure, they're able to regulate blood pressure in the entire body, essentially, ultimately. And that's a very important concept to keep in mind here as one of many functions of the kidney. And another function that many people do not usually think of, but is still quite important here, is that kidneys are able to produce hormones besides renin, besides the one for blood pressure I just mentioned. There's also something called erythropoietin, which is a hormone necessary for normal red blood cell production in the bone marrow. So keep in mind, we said this already, that red blood cells, just like other components of blood, white blood cells and platelets, are all produced in the bone marrow, deep inside our bones. And in order to regulate the production of red blood cells, this hormone is produced by the kidneys called erythropoietin, or EPO, and it travels essentially from the kidney to the bone marrow to regulate production of red blood cells. And obviously, at the end, ultimately, urinary tract is there to transport urine, to make sure that it's moved through all these passageways, like I said before, and gets out from the body. Again, keeping in mind, the urine is produced in the kidney, travels then through these hollow muscular tubes called the ureters. This is just, keep in mind, only one side, right? I didn't draw, this is just like, we'll say the right side, if you're looking at the person like this, at the patient. And obviously symmetrical, so the left side is exactly the same. So the urine travels, goes into the bladder. There's going to be these openings here, right, for the urine to enter the bladder, and an opening at the bottom for the urethra to transport the urine and expel it out of the body. Now, looking at the rest of the anatomy of the kidney, so primary structure of the kidney is essentially the renal cortex. That's the outer portion of the kidney, right? Usually kind of lightly colored because there's fewer blood vessels there. This is where the main structure of what's called the nephron begins. The rest, deeper inside, darkly colored, is the renal medulla. And then the lowest portion, which is basically the deepest kind of area here, is the renal pelvis, which is honestly just essentially just a space, like a sink, that the urine goes to before it's able to get out from the kidney into the ureters. So the main components, again, is the cortex and the medulla. Both of this could be seen under a microscope. They both have blood vessels. Medulla has a lot more blood vessels, so it participates in more of the sort of quick exchange of molecules that is so necessary for proper filtration. And when you're thinking of the nephron, which I'm going to talk about very soon, basically you're going to see that the main component, the beginning of the nephron, actually begins in the cortex and then sort of continues through the medulla and then comes back to the cortex again. Again, keep in mind the renal pelvis just serves as a way to collect the urine. Make sure you look at the diagrams, pictures in the book to see all of this properly. And obviously on the histology slides, images, you can also see this in more detail microscopically. But don't forget about the gross anatomy, right? Obviously for these organs, very important to visualize them, to see them. The kidney is not a very large organ, but has quite extensive kind of anatomical features there that are very important. Now, when we think of the kidney, we're saying that the main functional unit or the most important component that makes kidney what it is what's called the nephron. And the nephron does basically three things. It filters the blood, it allows for reabsorption of molecules that are important to us, that we don't want to lose, and allows for forced secretion of molecules that are waste. So filtration just is like overall concept. Molecules are passing through capillaries, they're specialized in the kidney, back and forth exchange. If these are good molecules, like glucose, like different electrolytes, like maybe sometimes spilled red blood cells or protein, these molecules will be reabsorbed, will be taken back. And if these are waste molecules that we're in, like let's say excess potassium, like creatinine, like urea, some others, maybe certain medications you take and certain drugs, they will be forced to be excreted or secreted, the correct way to say this, renal secretion, we say this, out of the system, and that's how it's going to wind up in the urine, basically. Okay, so now, what are the parts of the nephron? So the nephron, again, it's quite a complex structure. I definitely need to see it in the book, what it looks like. I don't require you to memorize what it looks like necessarily, but be familiar with at least a general kind of overview of the main components. So in the cortex, in the renal cortex, we start essentially with the beginning of the nephron, which is called the renal corpuscle, which contains a ball of capillaries, which we call glomerulus. This ball of capillaries is very important. This is where the exchange of molecules begins, kind of filtration starts there. And that ball of capillaries is surrounded by basically what's called the Bellman's capsule that kind of catches the filtrate as it tries to pass through this system. And then we start with what's called first proximal tubule or proximal convoluted tubule. Convoluted just means that it kind of twists and turns, right? We can kind of omit that word. But basically proximal means it's closest to the beginning area. And then we continue through into what's called loop of Henle. And then down into the, basically, once we're in the loop of Henle, we're going to go into the renal medulla. That's where a lot of blood vessels are, so they surround these loops of Henle, and the exchange of molecules continues, right? The filtration continues, and then we come back to the renal cortex in what's called the distal tubule, which is very, very similar in appearance to the proximal tubule, just continues that process in the nephron of filtration. And then finally, when the urine is basically being produced, it goes into the collecting ducts, and final exchange of kind of water molecules takes place there. And finally, right, the urine could be placed into the renal pelvis and eventually will go into the ureters to go down to the bladder. Once the urine is in the bladder, we keep in mind that the bladder is essentially a muscular pouch, okay? Every time urine moves through all these areas, it moves through what's called peristalsis. This is the process of smooth muscle contractions that's so important as it has been done in the digestive tract, in other areas where smooth muscle occurs, and definitely here. So the urine doesn't just drop down here, it's actually moved carefully through peristalsis. And once it goes through the ureters into the bladder can expand with urine. Once about around 200, 300 ml of urine, milliliters, right, 200 to 300 milliliters of urine gets into the bladder. There's these sensory receptors there that stretch and that send the signal to the brain to say that, okay, it's time to relieve the bladder, right, to go to the bathroom for urination, to expel the urine out of the body. And so again, the process is that once enough urine accumulates in the bladder, the sensory mechanisms have been triggered that sends the information to the brain through the nerves, and then the sphincters here, these are muscles, okay, that are sometimes voluntary, sometimes involuntary, like these circle muscles that can open up and allow the urine to escape out of the bladder through the urethra. Now, a very important thing about the urethra is that it's different in male and female. So in the reproductive chapter, we're going to talk about this, but I'll mention this right now as well. In the female, the urethra is very short. It's just about just a few inches long, and essentially the urine is expelled by gravity. Once the sphincter is open, the urine goes down from the bladder to the outside, and it's kind of very simple, very straightforward process. In the male, the urethra is much longer and much more complex because it has to go, remember, through the urinary system and the reproductive system still, through the penis, right? So the urethra could be penile urethra, could be prostatic urethra, depending how it's traveling through there. You'll see that in the pictures. This has enormous clinical implications that we're going to discuss a little bit today. And again, we'll come back to this in the reproductive system as well. So now, keep in mind also that histologically transitional epithelium is the kind of epithelium linings we have everywhere the urine is traveling. So in the renal pelvis, there's transitional cells. Inside the ureters, inside the bladder, everywhere where urine is traveling, essentially, there's transitional cells. One exception is only the urethra to some extent, as that one can vary, and essentially either is just stratified squamous cells, those flat cells, they're able better to handle kind of traumatic impact, and sometimes some other kind of epithelium as well. Again, but ideally when you're thinking of the urinary tract, the mucosa, the deeper tissue inside, you're thinking where the urine makes contact with the cells, it's making contact with these transitional epithelial cells. Now, for the clinical disorders here, again, there's quite a lot of them. There's some basic things that everyone should be familiar with. Essentially, very common is something called kidney stones or nephrolithiasis. So nephro refers to the kidney, L-I-T-H, lith means stones or rocks. Right? This is a very common condition when a person develops these little solidified, essentially calcium-based compounds inside the kidney. We don't know exactly what causes them usually, but they do occur. A lot of them are asymptomatic, meaning no symptoms are shown by the patient. If the patient does develop symptoms, it's usually because the stones have started to kind of migrate or pass down from the kidney into the uterus and down, and obviously down into the bladder. This is very painful. Ideally, right, you want to treat this condition when the symptoms appear, and one of the main treatments right now is to essentially kind of bombard the kidneys with these ultrasound waves that break apart the stones into almost sand-like formations. They're so small that they can more successfully pass out of the body. So again, kidney stones, nephrolithiasis is a very common condition. Another very common condition is UTI, or urinary tract infections. UTI, urinary tract infections. This is a very common condition, especially in women, again, due to the shortness of the urethra, as the bacteria has an easier path to travel from the outside, from the skin, into the bladder. And in the male patients, UTI is only common in cases where there is a catheter has been inserted or some kind of surgical procedure, basically an intervention. If no interventions take place, it's very rare for a male patient to get UTI. Again, the reason is because the urethra is so much longer, so it's much harder for bacteria to take that path from the skin, from the outside, into the bladder or into the urethra. Okay. Another kind of common condition, relatively speaking, is hematuria or bleeding that's found, or blood essentially in the urine. There's two types of hematuria. One that the patient will complain about, so it's gross hematuria, when you can actually see your blood in the urine. This could be due to trauma, due to cancer, tumor formations, bleeding from kidney stones, things like that. Or microscopic hematuria, which is more difficult to diagnose. This is where a doctor has to pick it up on a microscope and sees that a few red blood cells have been spilled there, and that is still could be significant. It could be a sign of infections, could be a sign of kidney stones, or some kind of deeper damage, inflammation, infection inside the kidneys. Again, hematuria, blood in the urine, two different types, gross and microscopic. Make sure you know the difference between them. Sometimes the person is producing more urine than normal. We call this polyuria, right? Again, this could be just physiological. If you were drinking a lot of liquids that day and producing more urine and it's very dilute, you have polyuria, right? You're just producing more urine. That's all that means. Does not exactly tell you what's been happening. But just kind of an important terminology to keep in mind. Sometimes it's possible for a person to produce no urine, right? If the kidneys are failing, this happens to people who have long-term kidney damage or diabetes or other serious medical conditions. They might have anuria, which means no urine has been produced. Anuria, no urine is being produced. In most extreme case, that means essentially the kidneys have stopped functioning, and so that leads us to renal failure. Renal failure or kidney failure, again, refers to the condition when, due to long-term trauma, damage from inflammation, cancer, diabetes, or high blood pressure, the kidneys have stopped filtering the blood properly, right? The nephrons have shut down and can no longer do their job, so the person now basically cannot filter the blood. Now, person cannot survive without kidneys. Kidneys are absolutely essential, critical organs. At least one kidney needs to be functioning at all times. And so that person usually who is in renal failure will need to undergo hemodialysis. I'm sure you've heard of dialysis, and essentially this is when a person is hooked up to a machine that artificially, essentially, transfers the blood out of the body, cleans the blood, filters it, and then returns it back to the body. Right? Dialysis usually is a very intensive procedure, difficult for many patients, has all kinds of side effects, and basically a person has to be on it chronically for quite a long time, if not perpetually, forever. Now, there are multiple different types of dialysis. The hemodialysis, the most common one, is the one I'm referring to here. Essentially, again, this is done for those people who are in renal failure. They don't have that many options. The most common option that's taken is hemodialysis. Now, ultimately, for some patients, hemodialysis becomes too difficult to undergo after a period of time, and they need to transition to obtaining a kidney transplant or a renal transplant. There's two types of kidney transplants that are possible. One is cadaveric kidney, meaning from a cadaver, person who has died. Usually this is someone who is relatively young with all healthy organs, but maybe died due to like brain damage or some kind of a motor vehicle accident, something like that, or a gunshot wound to the head. And their kidneys could be obtained. And even better form is from a living donor donation, from someone who is compatible to you after blood testing and essentially all kinds of special tests done, laboratory tests and other medical clearances need to be done. And if that person is able to donate blood, donate the kidney, then that kidney could be taken and essentially placed usually into the pelvis and reconnected properly, so somewhere over here basically, in order to help that person survive. Again, keep in mind, living without kidneys that are functioning is essentially impossible. The person does need to be either on dialysis, some kind of dialysis, or need to receive a transplant, otherwise they cannot survive. Again, for all of this information, make sure you're reading chapter 15 on the urinary tract, and look at all the illustrations, the diagrams and everything that the author is describing.